Chapter 6. The Luau. The day for the luau was set after the Chinese holiday. Mother told Ah Chong when he came to the store that she wanted 2 150-pound pigs for the quilting luau, the second week in February. Each mother who helped with the quilting and their daughters had their share in preparing this luau. For weeks they walked the beach gathering opihi, vana, ha-uke-uke, and a'ama, or black crab, and paella crab. Only 2 kinds of seaweed, or limukohu and lipoa, were gathered. The first limu the turtle fed on, and it was potable with the food you ate. The second was used as spicing for raw fish, which gave it the seaweed aroma. At the end of each day before returning home, all of the women cleaned and salted their catch at the beach. They each had their different wooden calabashes and Hawaiian alai and black salt. With the opihi shell, they picked the meat out with another empty shell. When the calabash was about half full, they added salt. By using both hands and mixing and squeezing, they separated the intestines from the meat. Then the meat was put in another calabash. This operation was repeated until all the meat was in the calabash. The remains were thrown away. The vana was covered with many sharp needles. They used an iron claw made from fence wire to pick up the vana, and then put it in a gunny sack and rolled the sack on a flat rock until the needles broke off. The vana was then poured out and washed. By holding the vana with their hands and tapping the rock on the side, the shell would open. Then pressing down the shell to open it wide, they used their fingers to take out the meat. It looked like 5 or 6 little tongues. It was then put in a calabash and mixed with salt. And that is all there was to it. The ha-uke-uke was purple in color, flat at the bottom, like a short, blunt pencil around the edge, with a concave top. After washing it, they took a small rock and tapped on the top, then opened the shell with both hands and dropped it in the calabash, sprinkled in Hawaiian salt, and left it at that. The black crab, or a'ama, was only caught at night with a torch made from dry coconut leaves. To make a torch, they found a dry coconut frond, and about halfway up, they took the leaves and wove them together. The paella crabs were caught along the crevices of rock near the edge where the waves flowed. As the waves went out, the women would then just pick up the paella or white crab. They were very good to eat. The black crabs were treacherous with their claws. The women picked up 1 crab at a time on its back and pressed with their fingers, which would open the back of the crab. They then sprinkled it with salt, covered it, and placed it in the calabash. By that time, the crab was lifeless. The white crab was kept alive and cooked during the day of the luau. Some of the mothers went to the beach with small nets at early dawn to catch ohua. If ohua is caught before the sun rises, it is all white and transparent. It gets dark during the day. When there was a school of ohua, the whole village would be at the beach to take some home. Ohua is supposed to come from the whale, a substance that the whale throws out. It was washed ashore and broken up by the breakers. After the ohua was washed and sprayed with salt, it was left for the next day. It was poured in a clean water pan. The women just picked it up in their hands and spread it on a drying board, which was 2 pieces of lumber 1 inch by 12 inches by 10 feet put together. About noon, they turned it to the other side. In the evening, the ohua was dried and ready to eat. Some women picked green weeds, auhuhu, in a bundle and pounded them until shredded, then washed them in the pond. This was done when the tide was low. The fish would become paralyzed for a short while. They all floated up, and the big ones were picked up, but they let the small ones go. When high tide came in, the paralysis left the fish and they swam away. Half of the catch were scaled and their intestines cleaned out, and then cut in small pieces and salted to be eaten raw. This was called poke. The other half was cleaned and salted to be made into lavalu. It was wrapped in tea leaves and charcoal broiled. The poke meat was mixed with raw onion and inamona. Inamona is the kukui nut roasted and pounded with Hawaiian salt. The men went out in their canoes and caught kava, or tuna, called small bonito. The mothers cleaned the fish. The intestines, the bone, and the fish head were cleaned and cut up in small pieces, salted, and garnished with chili peppers and kept in a calabash. This delicacy was called palu and could be eaten as long as it lasted. The fillet meat was salted for eating raw. Many other fish, such as ulua, papio, kumu, ahi, were cleaned and salted for drying. At the luau, some of the fish was charcoal broiled, and the rest eaten as dried fish. The squid and eel were dried the same as the fish. The husbands and sons did the digging of taro root, yams, and ava root, and picked the breadfruit. The tea root was cooked and fermented to be distilled into okolehau, or Hawaiian gin, which is 98 proof. The boys climbed for coconuts, husked them, and grated the meat to make kulolo, or pudding. They combed the cliff for wild honey needed in the kulolo recipe. To make the best kulolo or pudding, the coconut must be dry, which is when the husk is light or dark gray. When green or light yellow coconuts are considered, their meat is mushy. To make the kulolo, first the coconut was husked with any sharp object, the end of a pickaxe or a growing guava stump cut on a slant to make a sharp edge. Then it was cut in half with a piece of iron 1/4 inch thick and 2 inches wide and 12 inches long, with one end of the iron filled to make about 4 teeth, like a saw. It was then extended 4 inches out, and the rest nailed onto a box. They just sat on the box with a bowl on the ground and began grating by holding the shell in the palm and rubbing up and down on the sharp edge. This was the easy way to work. The coconut milk was saved when it was cut in half. This was poured into the grated coconut, just enough to look mushy. After washing the raw taro, the skin was peeled from the meat, cut in half, and grated the same way as the coconut. Then a 5-gallon kerosene can was cut lengthwise, making 2 cans. The grated coconut was put in a big pan and poured into a mosquito cloth, and the juice squeezed into another pan. The coconut milk was mixed with honey and brown sugar and poured on the grated taro. Then all the ingredients were poured in the can lined with tea leaves and then covered with more tea leaves, placed in an imu, or ground oven, exactly the same covering as if cooking a pig with all the delicacies. It took about the same time to cook the coconut pudding. The taro root and breadfruit were washed and cooked separately in metal pots filled with water at the same level of the taro or breadfruit. The breadfruit was cut in half and placed in the pot face down. The pot covering used was a wet gunny sack. It was cooked if a piece of stick pierced it easily. The taro and breadfruit were then put in a dry pan. To peel the skin from the taro and breadfruit, the women used an empty opihi shell. The taro was then set on a wooden board that was half hollowed. Then they got a poi pounder, which is a rock that would fit the hollow in the left hand and extended below, half round in size, just a little bigger than the hand. It weighed about 10 pounds. The women wet the stone with the right hand every time they pounded and twisted the taro. When the taro began to form into a dough, they took the dough and mixed by hand until it became soft. This was called poi. The poi was placed in a wet barrel and covered with cloth. The same was done with the breadfruit. The yams were placed with the pig in the imu. The ava root was chewed raw and placed in a bowl. It was then mixed with water and strained into a mosquito net. The fiber was thrown away. This drink was for the old folks. The tea root was cooked in the ground and then chopped and placed in a wooden barrel to ferment. It was distilled and steamed and siphoned through bamboo. The legend is that it looks like clear water. The taste is mild, but the strength is 98 proof. Okolehau will cook any raw egg, and if lit, will burn in a blue flame. The metal pot that the tea was cooked in had the shape of a man's buttock, or okole. Okolehau was the drink for everybody. The women cooked potatoes, pounded them like poi, and fermented them in a calabash to make a sour potato drink for children or the old folks. It was something like drinking beer, but not as harsh. The day before the luau, Ah-chong brought the 2 pigs alive to the store. They were tied to a guava stump in back of the house. The husbands began to dig the ground about 3 feet deep and 8 feet around. There was a pile of dry wood, 1 to 4 inches in diameter, already cut to 2-foot lengths, to be used in the imu, or ground oven, for the roasting of the pigs. After the pigs were slaughtered, they were hung up by both hind legs to drain out all the blood. When the imu was dug out, the dry wood was laid in it, and small rocks of about 2 or 3 inches were placed over the wood. Then the wood was lit and burned to ashes, and the rocks turned ember red. The men were now ready to roll the pigs, one at a time, over the hot rocks until all the hair was burned off. In the meantime, 2 pans of hot water were ready to clean the pigs. Whatever hair remained was rubbed with a warm, porous rock to remove it. Then they washed the pigs down with the hot water, peeled green papayas, cut them in half, took the seeds out, and rubbed the skin of the pigs. This would tenderize the meat when it was cooking. The pigs were then turned on their backs and opened from the forward legs to the rear legs. Since the pigs were male, the men had to be careful in removing the urinal bags so as not to break them. The intestines were cut out, cleaned, and then salted. They were eaten raw, which was called na'au o kapua'a, pig intestine. The liver was cleaned and roasted on a rock and was eaten by the workers. They then took a wet cloth and wiped the inside of the pigs and cut open the inside of the legs and the back end so they could put in the hot rocks. The pigs were then rubbed on the inside with the eating salt. Everything was ready for the day of the luau. The pigs were covered and left on the table. As the imu, or ground oven, was cold, the men removed the rocks but left the ashes in, laid wood at the bottom, and at the center used small firewood and piled the rocks around the imu over the wood, leaving the center open so they could start the fire for the roasting and cooking of the different delicacies. In the meantime, everything that was to be cooked with the pig was brought to the table. That evening, a canvas tent was put over the imu in case of rain. The natives were good forecasters of weather. There were no instruments to indicate anything about the weather. All of their lives they studied the wind clouds and the sun. When they forecasted the next day's weather, one could be sure it was correct. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the imu was lighted. By 3 o'clock, the rocks were ember red and the wood almost ashes. The rocks began to sag down, and the imu took on the shape of a saucer. The pigs were then brought near the imu. One of the husbands, wetting his hand in a bucket of water, picked up hot rocks and set one in each of the legs on the inside and pressed firmly. Another rock was placed at the throat and at the end of the hind legs. The rest of the hot rocks were put into the body of the pigs. Legs were brought together and tied with tea leaves. The imu at this time was ready to receive the pigs and the delicacies. The pigs were enclosed in a chicken wire net. The reason was that when they were cooked, it was easy to pick them from the imu. The pigs were placed in the center, the yams and potatoes around the pigs, then covered with green tea leaves, and a wet gunny sack was placed over the tea leaves. Then a dry canvas was placed over the whole imu. Dirt was put over the canvas so that the steam would not escape from the imu. It took a good 9 hours to cook. At noon, the luau feast was ready. At the side of the store, 4 posts were set up and lumber was set across them to secure them to the building. A large canvas was stretched above and tacked to the side of the store. The other side was held down by wooden pegs. There was no table, so everyone sat on the ground. Tea leaves were laid crosswise, in 2 rows to look like tables resting on the ground. There was enough room to house 50 sittings at one time. There were about 75 people, including children. All the bowls and plates were made out of tea leaves, except the calabashes in which the food was brought to the tables. Everybody ate with their fingers. The emu was uncovered. The pigs in the wire net were brought out first, followed by the yams and potatoes. The pigs were taken out of the chicken wire and placed on a flat hollowed wooden board, like those used in pounding poi, to hold the gravy. There, the pigs were broken into small pieces and placed in the calabashes with gravy, and dished out onto the tea leaves on the ground tables with all the other delicacies. The quilted blanket was set on the bed in the back room. After everyone had seen it, it was folded and put back in the sandalwood trunk. As everybody sat down with their legs crossed, my mother sat at the head and thanked all those who had helped and participated in making this Thanksgiving luau a success. She then bowed her head and said a prayer in thanksgiving for the food and for luck to go with the blanket. The luau lasted until midnight. Whoever stayed to clean up the place left in the morning. This was the end of one quilted blanket luau, and another was in the offing. This was a community project.